This is Gemara Nedarim, Daf Yomi. We welcome everyone back to another incredible week. B'siyata d'shmaya of learning the Daf together, and we have the schos of learning this week as a schos Ili Neshama for Moshe Rav Chaim Alevi Bernstein, a close friend of the Daf's father. B'siyata d'shmaya. The learning should bring Harav Moshe to higher in place in Gan Eden Shalmaila, an incredible milat yosher for his entire family and the entire Daf Yomi Chabura as well. So we're holding at the bottom of Yud Aleph Amid Beis. And the Gemara over here is in the middle of discussing what is the halacha of Rav Mirachama Shaila when someone said, Harei Olai Kebasar Zivchei Shamim La'achar Zrikas Damim. And when we finished the previous year, we modified this question that was not merely discussing La'achar Zrikas Damim, because if he said explicitly that this should be La'achar Zrikas Damim, that everyone agrees that it is a good neder, because as the Gemara explained, because then it's behetira kamadfis, because at that moment the carbon is allowed to be eaten after the zrika. The question is that there was basar of the shlamim in front of him, and there was another item, and he said this should be like this. And the question is, if saying A is like B, is that a good atfasa? Is that a good creation of the neder or not? So says the Gemara, Amar Rava. Apologies one more time, says the Gemara, Amar Rava Tashima. Let's bring a raya on the bottom of Yud Aleph Amid Beis. Rava says, what's the raya? Noisar upegel. And as we're going to see today numerous times, the Lashon Nedarim is definitely Mishana. The wording of the Gemara itself is not always so simple. Says Rava, Noisar upegel. What's going on over here? If someone says that this item should be like Noisar oy pegel. What is Noisar? We've seen many times. Noisar is a carbon when it's left over. What is pegel? We have seen that as well as when someone who has a machshava incorrectly when bringing a carbon. So we're bringing a raya specifically from Noisar, that if someone says that this entity should be like Noisar, what is the halacha? It works. And the item is forbidden to be eaten. Says the Gemara as we turn over to Yud Beis Amud Aleph. So we see that if someone says it's like Noisar Pigel, it works. So now explains the Gemara, Noisar Pigel, what is Noisar and Pigel? La'achar Zrikas Damim. When does an entity become Noisar? As we just explained, the entity becomes Noisar after you pass over the required time to eat a carbon. Every carbon you could eat for 1 or 2 days. After that amount of time, the carbon is Noisar, literally leftovers. Even though, when did this occur? This of course occurs after the dam is thrown. Yet it works. What does that mean? That must meaning it works, that it becomes a neder. So it must mean that's a raya bi'ikaroi kamadfis. It must be that what was your intent? That you're going back in time, that when you said that this item should be like Noisar, what is your intent? Your intent is that the item itself, the original status of the item, which was forbidden. So says the Gemara, and it was forbidden like the carbon. So we have a raya bi'ikarei kamatfis. Amar le Ravuna Breid Rav Nasan, no raya. Why not? Bin Noisar shel oila. We're discussing Noisar shel oila, and of course a carbon oila is Kalil La Hashem, is completely burnt up, and there's never a moment of time that you could eat it. We thought we were talking about a shlamim. A shlamim is a carbon that the bailim, of course, can eat. If we're discussing a carbon that the bailim can eat, then we would have a raya bi'ikaroi kamadfis. That even though originally this carbon you could eat, now it became Noisar. The neder works. What must be the reason? Because you had in mind originally, even before the throwing of the dam, before the item became permitted to eat, that was what you were being matvis. You're saying this item is like this carbon, its original status. But answers the Gemara, no. What are we referring to? We're referring to bin noiser shel oila, which was always forbidden. Amar Lei responds to the Gemara, Im Kain, if what you're saying is accurate, then what are we referring to? Ben Noiser of Oila. So what should have it said? Ben Basar Oila. Why did it say that you're saying that it's a Noiser of Pigel? Why didn't we hone in on the fact, and the Mishnah should have said that he said to the meat of an Oila? What was the wording of the Bryce on the bottom of Yud Aleph Amid Beis? That you're making this item like what? Like Noiser, like Pigel. But if the entity was Oila, then that's the Nikuda. It's nothing to do with Noiser or Pegel. Answers the Gemara, Loi mi bayik amar. Loi mi bayik. Needless to say, it's pashit if it was Basar Oila da Aser. Dabe carbon kamathis. Why? Because if it's a Oila, the item was always forbidden for the Bailim to eat, then you're being matfis in a carbon. You're saying that this item should have the same status as a carbon. Noiser upegel the Oila. Says the Gemara, so lomi bayi bisar Oila daser. The carbon kamafis. What's the chiddush? Noiser upegel the Oila stricha. The chiddush, the novelty is that it's noiser upegel of an Oila. That's the chiddush. What's the chiddush? Kosal k'taytecha mina. I would have thought kisser noiser, kisser pigel. I would have thought that what did you mean when you said that this item, this cake or this loaf of bread, this cup of water should be like what? Should be like noiser, should be like the isser noiser, should be like the isser pigel. That's what I thought you meant. And if that's what you meant, then it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Again, what are we trying to figure out this hatfasa? That when you make entity A like entity B, says the Gemara, that would not have worked. Why not? Because havalei kimat vizbedavar aser. We're learning a bit of the rules of hatfasa as we go through. That would have been called matfis bedavar aser. That would have been called associating, saying A is like B. A, this kikar, this water, this loaf of bread is like what? Like an isser. And when you say something is like an isser, that does not work to create a neder. V'loi mitzar. And it doesn't make the item aser because it doesn't have the status of an appropriate neder. So kamash malon, the chiddush is that even though it's an aylah, you said that you want it to be like the nicer pickle of the aylah, it's still going to work and it's going to be yes and neder. So at some level we do have a raya, bi'karoi, matfes, that when you said I want this item should be like the shlamim, like the shlamim, and this carbon happens to be lachazrikas damim, your intent is the original entity of the shlamim, which was forbidden. Meisvei. Now, this word meisvei is a bit out of place, because we don't really have a raya, and really what should be more, says the Rosh, it should say tashemaz or bring your raya. Ezeu isar amar batayra. Says the Gemara 10 lines down, the first word in line is meisvei yebezam and aleph. Says the Reisa, what is the isser that the Torah talks about? How do you make a neder via hatfasa? Omar, you say, says the Raisa, I'm not going to eat meat. I'm not going to drink wine. A person says, I'm not going to eat meat, I'm not going to drink wine, just like the day his father was nifter kiyom shemis, but his Rebbe was nifter kiyom shenargu b'chadalim min achikam, the day that Saim Gedaliah Dalim min achikam was killed, kiyom sherisi Yushalayim b'charbana. If he said that, Hareini, I'm not going to eat Shaloi Oichal Basar like that fateful day, then what is the halacha? The halacha is that's a good hatfasa. Just like on those days it was forbidden to eat, so too, right now it's going to be forbidden via this net. Va'amar Shmuel, and Shmuel explains, V'ushen noder ba'oisayim. It doesn't just mean that day that person became an avel, and that's why you can't have wine and eat meat. But rather, it's that you actually made a neder on that day that the parent was nifter, on that day that the Rebbe was nifter many years prior. And now that you said that today should be like that day, that's an appropriate neder. So explains the Gemara, Eichi Dami, where 8 lines to the bottom, says the Gemara, what exactly is this case? Lav ki goyin de koi v'chad b'shaba. Says the Gemara, is the case not that you're standing on Sunday de Misvei Avua. You're standing on that Sunday, not the actual Sunday that the father was nifter, but the yahrzeit. Years later, you're standing on a Sunday, and v'afal gav di ketuva cha b'shabata, Shabbos de'atira. And even though maybe the father was nifter 5 years prior, and 5 years later you're standing there on a Sunday saying that today should be like that faithful Sunday. So you really have two things you could potentially mean. You could potentially mean all the Sundays in the past few years, which were mutter, which were days that you did not have anything that happened. Or you could mean that faithful Sunday many years prior. Vekatani aser. And what does the Brisa say? He says it's forbidden. Shema mina be'ikar udemafis. So we have a raya that when we have a choice, is your kavana, is your intent, write this item today, or is it be'ikr in its original form? We go back to the be'ikr, we go back to the original form. And therefore, if you are standing on a Sunday, we assume you're going back to that original faithful Sunday. So that's another raya that be'ikar kam hafis. Says the Gemara, 1 second. The Shmuel hachi itmar. You know what? You don't have a raya. Because you know why? When Shmuel came along and he added on to the Brisa, V'shenadar Brisa Ayoim, says the Gemara, do you know what that really means? Hamar Shmuel, 3 lines to the bottom, V'shenadar uba me'oisa Ayoim ve'eloch. Says Shmuel, what really is going on over here is that every single Sunday, every single yahrzeit, I should say, on that Sunday, you had a neder, and therefore you don't have a raya that it's bi'ikaroi kamanfis. You don't have a raya that necessarily is going back to the original Sunday, because in every single Sunday since that day there was a neder. And as always, whenever we have two ways of interpreting a brisa, what that means is that it's a dichoi, and we can't bring a raya from this brisa. So left with no choice, Amar Avina, 2 lines to the madam, Tashema, let's try again, Kechalas aroi nukjumasai. If someone says that the food of yours should be like Aroin's food, like Aroin's challah, and like his truma. What's the halacha? Mutter. The neder does not take effect. Why not? Because we think that chalas aron and truma is something that is aser be'etzem. It's inherently forbidden. Therefore, it's not something you can be matfis on. Just like we said a moment ago, that you cannot be matfis on the Isser Neder, the Isser Pigel. So too we think is the same thing. Chalas Aron Uktumasai. Says the Gemara, and the Gemara is Medayik. Ha ke chumas lachmei toida. Aser. But if you made the neder that this item should be like the truma of the breads of the carbon taida, then the neder does yes work. So says the Gemara, as we turn over to Yud Beis Amid Beis, says the Gemara, at what point are we discussing these carbon truma, the breads of the lachmei taida? Is la'achar zrikas damim hi? It's after the dam, of course, was already sprinkled, because only then you have these breads. And yet, what do we see? We see that it is effective, that there is a neder in such a case. So what do we see? Again, attempt number 3 to bring a raya, bi'ikaroi kamatfis, a raya that referring to the ikar, to the item itself, essentially back in the beginning. Says the Gemara, no raya. You know why not? Because ema kitchumas halishka alser. You know why it's no raya? Because we could say that, you know what he meant? He meant like the truma of the lishka, the truma of the treasury. That's when it's forbidden. Why? Because that is not an item. That is an item that is always aser. And that was obviously something you could do atfasa with. And therefore, we don't have a raya, says the Gemara, from this case. Let's just look at the Ran over here who explains what's his answer. Chumas alishka. On the last wide line at the top of the Amid says the Ran. Chumas alishka shayitar mimois alishka umemalin shalish kupais. That's something that's always going to be forbidden. So says the Gemara, 1 second, let's go back. What's the obvious implication? It sounds like what would be the status of the truma of the lachmei toida? Would sound like that would be mutter. Only this case is aser. But if you're talking about the truma of the lachmei toida, sounds like that would indeed be aser. So ask the Gemara, listening, so it should have said lachmei toida v'kolshkein truma asai. It should have listed the case of lachmei toida, and then from there we learn out certainly the truma of Aaron. Because even if the truma of the carbon taida, the breads, was originally usher by a neder, that cannot be the item that you could do via hatfasa. So since the Mishnah says that halacha not in this way, but rather what did the Mishnah say? Kitrumas Aaron. And the Mishnah spoke about such a scenario. Must be that the truma of the lachmei taida is yes, a valid mikar, is a source this in. Says the Gemara, Noraya, Kamashlan, Trumas Lachmei Toida, Trumasahi. That all it's going to be teaching us that the status of the Lachmei Toida is the same status of Aaron's Truma, therefore we can't bring a Raya. Now this Iba Yisema that we're up to, 5 lines to the top of Yud Beis Amud Beis, what in reality is going on over here is we're talking about Aaron's Truma. And we're saying that when he said Ketrumas Aaron, it does not include the Lachmei Toida. So therefore, says the Gemara, so why can't this be the Makar? The only hava why this was a good source is because the Lachmei, the breads, are also after the Zrikas Damim. Says the Gemara, no, really referring to the bread before the Zrika. Why? How could you have such a scenario? You separated the truma, you separated the part that's going to be given to the kohanim, belisha, while the entity was still in the dough form. And therefore, since it was separated already in the dough form, before the zrika, the carbon was done, therefore you can't bring a raya. And now we segue slightly off track into these halachas of the mafrasha of the truma. Really, how many breads everyone knows is the carbon taida, the lecham, and the breads are 40 breads. But this guy went and he made only 4. What's the halacha? Yatsa, he is yaitz. Says Gemara, why? Says Gemara, mitzvah. No, that's the spitz, that's the best, that's the mitzvah, but it suffices with 4. Asks the Gemara, mishkal truma. But what do you mean? How can you tell me it suffices with 4? But you have to take off truma. So how can you have 4 full loaves? We think the truma usually is 1 loaf of the 10, and therefore it's 4 loaves of the 40. But over here, if you have 4 loaves at the end of the day, when did you take off the truma to give to the Kehanim Levim? Maybe you take 1 of these 4 breads and you give that for all of them, but Tanan it can't be. Says the Mishnah, we call carbon shlo make carbon al chaveiroi. You're not able to do that. So maybe you took a piece off of each of these 4 big breads. You're not to take a piece. You have to separate a full challah. So ask the Gemara, what is going to be the case? That you're being mafresh the truma from the challah while it's still dough, and therefore we don't have a raya for this case. The price you're referring to that you separate in the dough form, that what? 6 lines from the bottom, that the case is you took 1 of each of these pieces in the dough form, then you form these 4 breads. And that's the reason why we don't have a raya in this case, because it's not talking about our case, but rather it's referring to separating the truma in the earlier in the dough form. So the Gemara tried extensively, today's whole daf was trying to bring a raya, whether it be ikaroi kamatbis, or whether we go by the item in its present state. Let's remind ourselves, what are we referring to? Referring to that you have item A in front of you and you have a carbon shlamim nachar zrika in front of you. And you say item A should be like this. The Gemara wants to know, does that work? At the end of the day, we try to bring numerous rayos that be ikaroi kamaf, is that your intent is to go back on the form originally when it was forbidden, but we do not have a raya, and therefore we're going to stop over here, which the Gemara tomorrow is going to pick up with a lema kitanoi. Let's indeed suggest that this is an earlier machlokes tanoim.